Welcome to the Calling the Quarters podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. This is Season 1, Episode 7. Today, I will be speaking with noted author Byron Ballard. She is a Western North Carolina native, a teacher, folklorist, and writer. I had a wonderful time talking to Byron, and I really enjoyed getting to talk to somebody who had a historical perspective on modern paganism and was able to share her personal stories. Without further ado, I'm going to take you to my conversation with folklorist, writer, priestess, Byron Ballard. Welcome to the Calling the Quarters podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones, and today I'm talking with author, folklorist, podcaster, and more, Byron Ballard. Byron, thank you for being on the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. I've been very excited about this day.
And I want to talk with you about your books, but first I want to talk to you about yourself. Can you tell us where you grew up and what you've been doing with your life before you became a famous writer?
Well, I was born in West by God, Buncombe County, North Carolina. From my front porch, I can see the mountain that I grew up on. So I live in Asheville, right above the old French Broad River. I went to public school for my high school years and my junior high school years, and then I did undergrad work here at UNC Asheville, and then did my graduate work in Texas, in Dallas. And I founded and ran with my husband a professional theater company for a while.
Oh, wow.
Then we had a wonderful, amazing daughter, and we determined that it was just not fair to raise a child who would not see us very much because we were doing so much theater. And we went on a hiatus that has turned into a more permanent. I'm not saying I'll never do it again because I'm actually working on a play right now. So I did theater for many years. And then when my daughter was born, I started thinking about spiritual things in a more solid way than I had. And then I started developing a pagan community. No, I'm going to take that back. Not developing. I started gathering in the pagan community that was already here. And then all of us together grew it into the pagan community we have now. So that here in Asheville, North Carolina, little old Asheville, we have a pagan nonprofit called the Coalition of Earth Religions for Education and Support. And we have a goddess temple, Mother Grove Goddess Temple. And we have beautiful metaphysical shops, and we have tons of activities going on. Yesterday, in fact, we did the Mother Grove Goddess Temple's public Beltane festival. We all went down by the river and danced the maypole and danced the spiral dance and just had a wonderful time. So that's what I do. And I'm a gardener and a forest farmer. I used to call myself an urban homesteader, but I don't do that so much anymore because it seems challenging to the people who aren't particularly interested in it. Because I never want people to feel guilty, because guilt, she shakes her finger, guilt is an emotion that makes us feel like it's an action. And when you feel guilty about something, it makes you feel like you're doing something about the problem when really you're just feeling something. So I didn't want anybody to feel like, oh, well, if she did that, I should be able to do it too, because we have a lot of work to do in our communities and in our world. And people should do what they are called to do. They should do the work of their hands as they are called to do it.
At what point in your life did you start to feel the stirrings that led to you, calling yourself, and I want to let you give yourself, say what titles you like to use, but pagan or witch, when did that come to you?
Gosh, that is such a good question. I came from a family in which the women's line, the matrilineal line, was referred to themselves with the word witch. Now, it was not a religious designation or a spiritual designation. They were all good Methodists. But the folklore that I practice, Appalachian folklore, comes down to us through a Protestant Christian filter.
Right.
And so they were doing all those practices, but they didn't think of it as a spirituality because they were good, staunch Methodists.
Right.
So my whole life, I grew up with that word, with the word witch. I was fortunate, and I will use that word very directly. I was fortunate to grow up unchurched, however. So I am not a Methodist because my father had some sort of argument with the minister at the church that they attended, and they left the church and they never found another home church. So my brother and I were raised, as we say here, unchurched. And that opened up a whole world to me that I'd never known before. I remember I read D'Aulaire's mythology, Gods of the Greeks and Romans, that one.
I love that. Yeah.
That has those really kind of glorious but slightly funky illustrations. I remember reading that. And then the next thing that I found was an excerpt from The Hobbit, which led me to The Hobbit when I was about 10, which led me to The Lord of the Rings after that. And that really, it did so much about my worldview, about being in communion with the earth, understanding that different people do things differently, that there are different cultures. All of that just came flowing into my life because I lived in a rural area where everybody around me, half of them were related to me, to be honest. And the other half, it was mostly white Protestant, middle class and lower middle class folks. And that was my worldview, that you got out in the daytime, you went out and worked in the garden, or you climbed up on the mountain, or you picked apples, or you processed food for the winter. And the idea that there were cultures that were not like that was a grand surprise to me, a wonderful surprise. So I've been a witch as long as I can remember. That word has always been present in my vocabulary, and I've always claimed that word. But pagan came later because I didn't have a spirituality. I went to church with different friends to different places. I went to a Catholic church with one friend and a Church of God with another friend. And all of those things, and the Methodist church with my grandmother. So all of those things informed who I was spiritually, but I didn't have really a spiritual home. And I can remember in probably middle school, so what would that have been, 13, 14, thinking, well, why are the Roman and Greek gods, why do we refer to them in the past tense? And we refer to this God in the Methodist Church as very present, but not actually physically present, but just sort of present up in the sky. And it just got me thinking about divinity. And of course, I didn't think of it in those terms when I was 12 and 13, but I just thought in terms of, well, these goddesses are cool. I was in love with Athena because gray eyes, smart, daddy's girl, all of that, owls, all of that played into Athena. Was amazing. I mean, look at her. She was born fully armored from her father's head. And why didn't we worship her anymore? Those are the questions I had as I dove into kind of, well, what we thought of, that would have been the early 70s, late 60s, what we thought of as the world cultures of mythology, which for most of us were Greeks, Romans. That's about it. Greeks and Romans. We didn't talk much about Celts or Asia or Africa or any of that. It was Greeks and Romans, Greeks and Romans. So that was my foundation for becoming a pagan. I didn't use that word, I think, until high school, maybe. And that would have been in the 70s. And I've embraced it ever since. I still embrace it. I know there are many people who don't like that word. They think it's a kind of an old-fashioned way to describe who and what we are. But yeah, I'm a garden variety pagan. Now I attach to that the word animist, because paganism, as I understood it at that early age, was really about everything being ensouled. And I've always felt that since I was a child, that the trees have souls, and the stones, and certainly animals. And in fact, I think animals and trees often have more soul than humans do at this point.
I
So
find
yeah.
that people have been, and I think it's a good term, because I think we've had I've seen a lot of differences in the terms that were used, because we had the word witch used quite a bit, I think, in the 70s, but then people started saying pagan, and then Wiccan was a common term, but then that wasn't always applicable. So it's hard, because sometimes people are like, well, what is your path? And I'm like, well, hold on, do you have like 10 minutes for me to give the Venn diagram? It's not always easy, right?
I taught for a year at a private school, and they asked me to speak in chapel one week about what it was I did. And there were a couple of students who were from somewhere in Africa, I can't remember where, and they just looked so puzzled, like, I don't even know what you're talking about. And then afterwards, when we were doing the thing that pastors do, where you stand at the door of the church, the chapel, and shake hands with people, and one of them came up to me and gestured to his friend, and he said, we were very confused about what you were saying. And I was getting ready to do my 10-minute talk, like you were just saying. And they said, and then we realized you're an animist. We totally get that. And so they understood it maybe before I did. But that's the word I often use now in conversation, because, Wicca is in common usage throughout the overculture. And people don't understand that Wicca is a set of specific spiritual traditions.
Yes.
That Wicca does not equal pagan.
Right.
And when we used to talk about, do you remember when we talked about the big umbrella was pagan, and then the big umbrella became pagan heathen, and underneath it were all these other things. And now I think we blew the umbrella out. We don't really have an umbrella anymore, which is probably good for us. It's probably good for us.
Yeah, I tried to teach a class once. I was asked to teach a class during a religious class I had in college, and I think the participants were more confused when I was done than they were when I had started.
I had one of those experiences at a local university here, where they brought me into the women in religion class, and they wanted me to talk about the temple and about goddess worship. And so I did my dog and pony show about the divine feminine and about Mary, and I did all of that stuff. And there was this handful of young men who were from a very rural part of the county. And it's the county where my father grew up. So much of my folkloric work comes out of that region. And at the end of the class, the professor said, now, if you don't mind, since we've got a few minutes, would you talk to us about the folklore work that you do and the folk magic work? And these guys were just like, I'm a Baptist. I'm not going to listen to any of this. And my soul is not going to be endangered by whatever she says. And as soon as I started talking about mason jars full of corn liquor with preserved roots in them, or ways to take the heat out of a burn, they all perked up. So when the class was over, the folks who had come for the women in religion part all filed out, because they were going to go get coffee and do whatever. And these young men just gathered around me, and they said, you do what my grandma does. You do what my great aunt does. Oh, I want to know more about that. So the religion piece for them it dissipated, because they suddenly heard somebody talking in a professorial way with that sort of agency about the folklore and the folk ways that they had known their whole lives. And it was a wonderful experience for me.
Can you talk about your temple and your current spiritual practice?
Yes, my spiritual practice, which is somewhat different actually from my magical practice, I am a goddess worshiping woman. I exclusively see the divine as female, and I always have. It's not a political thing. It may be because I grew up in a matrifocal, matrilineal family, but I've
Yeah.
always seen the divine as feminine. So that's what I do. And the temple is now 15 years old. Isn't that amazing? And it started
Wow.
because of Earth Day. Earth Day
Oh,
has always been significant to me, and more Earth Day is celebrated with a whole bunch of beer, because we are the craft beer capital of the country. It's
oh,
celebrated with beer and bands and dancing or whatever, and the idea that you would use that time to clean up a street or a stream or whatever is often lost. So I lamented that, and I remember writing big essays that were on the witch's voice, good old witch box, about when the pagan community was going to step up and acknowledge that we're pagans and that's an earth-based thing. And I woke up one morning about 4 days before Earth Day and realized I wanted to add that to the Wheel of the Year. And I wanted it to be the lead-in to Beltane. And I wanted to do a ritual for Earth Day. So I called up 15 co-religionists and I said, I want to do this thing on Earth Day. I want to do it in this particular park. And can you bring something, a prayer, a song, a dance, anything to celebrate the earth and create a ritual around that? And it was amazing. They all brought incredible pieces that they'd been sitting on, waiting for a place to present and to honor. So afterwards, 8 of us got together around somebody's fire and drank tequila and ate cheese, as one does. And from that grew Mother Grove Goddess Temple, which didn't have a name at that point, but we all agreed that's what we were being called to do. And we did the official paperwork for the state, for the feds. So we are a 501c3. We're organized as a church. We do, I don't even know what to tell you that we do, because we're just now coming out of COVID, really.
oh, yeah.
Yeah, so we've been doing full moon and dark moon ceremonies on Facebook Live.
Oh,
And we occasionally have done an in-person public ritual. But yesterday was our first in-person public ritual for a holy day that was unmasked. And that felt significant. So what we're doing, which I think a lot of organizations are doing, is figuring out, what did we do to keep our community together during those times? What worked, what didn't work? What was the most valuable thing for the community? And for us, one of the most valuable things is that we kept doing the holy days and the moons, and we had a food pantry. And
oh, wow.
Food just kept going out. It's a small pantry, but it felt significant. So our organizing body is called the Circle of Council, and we are now figuring out what programs we want to push forward as we renew, as we rise like a phoenix, whatever metaphor you want to use, as we have the renaissance of the Goddess Temple. And we want to expand the food pantry for sure. And we also want to just bring more people in with ideas about how to weave together the community that is resilient and welcoming and strong, and then how we connect with other communities like that. So we're in the process of figuring out who we are again, and that's good. It's a good thing.
Yeah. I think a lot of people are in that boat right now. COVID really kind of disrupted so many aspects of people's lives. It stands to reason it would affect covens or spiritual groups as well.
Mm-hmm. And
now,
something I feel is very, very important is that we don't just remove ourselves from the World Wide Web and go, okay, we're going back now to doing things in person, that we wove such a beautiful community of South America and South Africa and Australia and Europe, so that a full moon ceremony, people would check in. Hi from Australia, hi from South Africa. And we can't negate that community. We can't say that community wasn't a real community. So I think it's incumbent on all of us who have done that to keep the thread alive, to realize that now we have double communities. We have the community that is present, physically present, and we also have an online community. And how we start to weave those two things together is going to be vitally important.
Have you ever had any instances where you've had discrimination or trouble based on your spiritual path?
Yes, let us begin. So it was surprising here. Asheville has always been it's been a tourist town. Years ago, the low country planters would come here because it was cool in the summer. So it's always had an influx of people who are not necessarily bound into the native culture. So when we first did some public things, there was some confusion, there was some anger, there was frankly some hatred. And we tried our best to walk through all of them. The thing that is almost forgotten at this point, and that's probably good because it was terribly traumatic for everyone concerned, in 1999, which is before many of the modern pagan people were even born,
Yeah,
we wanted to celebrate the expanse of our pagan witch communities. And we created a thing called Earth Religions Awareness Week. And it's the end of October, because there was a joke that we could go through the entire year doing all the things we do, but by golly, in October, that's when everybody wanted to talk to a witch. They wanted an interview, the papers wanted an interview, the TV wanted to talk to you. And so it was kind of a truism that we came out from under our rocks in October, and suddenly it was Witch Central.
yeah.
So we declared that week Earth Religions Awareness Week, which would culminate in Samhain. And I wanted to do a public ritual in the main square of downtown, which required me to have a permit from Parks and Recreation. And I thought the way to do that might be to get a mayoral proclamation of that week. And I did my research. I knew that the mayor had declared the first week in August as Methodist Assembly Week and Catholic Week and Baptist Home Week. So that's the notion of the separation of church and state has been little honored here. And so I knew it was possible. The mayors in previous administrations had done that. And we were really lucky with a very liberal mayor at that time. So I called the mayor's office and said, I'd like the mayor to consider doing a proclamation for a special week we're having in our community. And the woman said, yeah, just come by the office and pick out the form and fill it out and we'll get it to her. I was like, great. So I thought if I had that proclamation, it would help Parks and Rec think of us as legitimate.
Yeah.
So they called from the mayor's office and said, well, you have a couple of options. We can mail it to you, or you can pick it up, or would you like it presented at City Council? And I just was like, what? City Council? So we opted for the City Council. And the little children of our group presented the mayor with a handmade basket full of organic apples, and they sang her a little song, and she read the proclamation, and I looked out over a sea of pagan mamas and daddies and aunties and uncles smiling and crying. It's like, finally validation. But the local newspaper was there, and the headline the next morning was, witches come to City Council. Witches welcome at City Council. And the whole thing blew up. It became an international storm. I was interviewed by The Guardian. I was interviewed by the New York Times, and our community was threatened again and again with physical violence.
Jeez.
So that happened, and that's like the high point, I guess, for how this community has dealt with things. But there have been countless, I'm just going to say countless. There have been countless incidents of small groups being harassed, of people's backyard temples being turned over. We've gone through a lot of that, and when I'm traveling now, people say, "Oh, Asheville, you've got such a strong pagan community. That you are so lucky." And I tell them it's not luck. We built this community brick by brick, and before that, we made the bricks.
Yeah.
So any place can do this, but you have to have people who are passionate. You have to have people who are willing to work hard and willing to not take no. We're not willing to take no for an answer, and you can do that.
Do you have any memories of a first ceremony or like a first ritual that you did early on in your practice where it was very poignant for you?
I do. I guess we will call that my first degree initiation. I had been working with a circle of women when I was in college, and we were reading everything we could read about feminist spirituality. And this was the 70s, so there was lots of stuff going on, and so we decided we were gonna be initiated. We were gonna do self-initiation. But the college days then were, I guess, were different than they are now. There had been a beer bash by someone, and so we had been drinking beer, and we did this fabulous ceremony with flower crowns and all that beautiful stuff. And we did what has become pretty popular in some spiritualities. We did the rebirthing, where all of the women stood with their legs apart, and they pulled the initiate through their legs to the very end, and then the initiate stood up to become part of that line. And it was intensely powerful, but also we had been drinking a lot of beer, so we were a little nervous about the giggling and the pulling and all of that. But that, I think that set a tone for me that I love ritual that is both strong, powerful, meaningful, that shakes up the world, but is also accessible and fun. And that's one of the earliest ones I can remember that was with other people. I did tons of rituals as a kid up on the mountain or in the backyard or whatever.
Were there any authors that inspired you early on?
We've been having a discussion in social media and on Facebook recently about Eisler's The Chalice and the Blade.
Yeah.
And that book was profound for me. As I said before, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, Tolkien was also very profound for me. Plus reading Bullfinch and Edith Hamilton, all of that, it set me on a road that I've not left in all that, on all those intervening decades. I mean, I go off the path like this, and then I spent some time learning Old Irish so I could dig into some of those texts. I spent time learning different ways of doing ritual, but always those authors, those particular authors, Starhawk, of course, was hugely important. Patricia Monahan, all of her books, and the Cunningham. I mean, and Cunningham's books were important. Yeah, there's so many. And of course, now I read pagan books a lot because I am asked sometimes to endorse them or to write the foreword or whatever. So I read a lot of the modern things too. And I want to encourage people, yes, read the modern stuff. Honestly, I'm a writer. I want you to read my books, and I want you to read the books of sister authors and fellow authors who are also dropping new books every day. But don't forget about that old stuff. Don't forget about those old texts. Some of them are a little harder to read because our languaging around things has changed. But I think when you can parse it, when you can read between the lines and not get super judgmental and all up in that and read it, you're going to find things that will affect you deeply, deeply.
I'm old enough to have seen many things change in paganism over the years. I remember that when wearing a pentagram was something that could be it could make a big impact in your life, just
Yes.
surviving. And like I had Wicca on my dog tags, which caused me a lot of problems in the 80s. Now I don't think anybody would blink. Nobody would care. What changes have you seen since you started, down the path?
So many. I mean, we've seen both the broadening and the deepening of practice. We have seen at different times. I think about the charmed era when suddenly it was very popular. That must have
Yeah.
been, I'm guessing, the 2010s, something like that. It made it very popular, and people just glommed on to the idea of being a witch or being a pagan and wearing a big old pentacle, and that felt good to them. But so many of them dropped away and went on to the next faddish thing. And now we're in the TikTok generation of witchcraft, where there are people gatekeeping and explaining all the ways that you are doing it wrong. And I think in the early days, because there were so few of us, or fewer of us, we tried a lot of different things. We tried different ways of doing ritual and ceremony. We introduced ourselves, or were introduced to different kinds of divines. And there was more of a sense of freedom that everybody could figure out what it was their path really meant to them. But now I feel more and more that we are shutting some of those gates, and we're not allowing, not allowing is not the word, but there are people who want us to toe a line, and that is absolutely imperative for the more formal traditions. So if you were doing British traditional Wicca or Gardnerian, some of the other Wiccan traditions, they're very serious about, this is what the tradition is and we want you to stick to it.
Yeah.
But for most people, I say constantly that these religions are experiential. And if you can't feel it, I used to say, if I can't mainline deity, what is the point of doing anything that I do?
I love that quote. That's a great quote.
Because for me, that's the thing, is the connection, and the connection with the land with which we dwell, the planet, the cultures, our neighbors, the ancestors, the divines, the spirit folk. The connection is the piece that allows us to wield the kind of power we want to wield and that we need to wield in these really chaotic times.
You've written 6 books and you have a 7th coming out in September. Can you talk about when you decided, or you kind of realize, hey, I'm a writer, or have you always written?
I've always written. A friend who lived near me where I grew up, she and I used to write pass along stories. So she would take the notebook paper and she would write whatever, and then she'd hand it to me, and then I would take up the story and write. And this was, I don't know, we were 11 or 12 years old. So I've been writing probably my whole life, really. I was writing before I went to school, reading and writing before I went to school. So I've always been a writer. I began my kind of serious writing, not just journaling, with a playwriting class in grad school. And then I wrote plays. I've done adaptations of some of the classics. So I have a stage adaptation of Beowulf. I did Moby Dick, which was interesting because we made the audience be the whale. I did the Odyssey. And then I wrote a series of plays about local folklore, and those were fun too. But I started writing nonfiction pagan books. They're much more folkways books to begin with, because I could see my culture fading as people came in, my Appalachian culture. And like many people in this region, I couldn't wait to get out. I wanted to leave all that country life and all that hard subsistence farming living. I wanted to leave that behind. But when my daughter came, I wanted her to understand that there was value in that. And that's when I started really practicing it in a more public way. And as I saw things fading, I just wanted to write down the stuff that I knew so that it wouldn't be lost forever. And a woman who's still a very good friend of mine, her name is Mary Jo Moore, is a Cherokee writer and publisher. And she, at that point, was publishing only indigenous native writers. And she said, "You were doing so much writing. I want to offer to you that I will create an imprint of my publishing house, which is Renegade Planets." And she said, "I'll create for you, since you are not, I am native, I guess, but not in that sense. I'm going to create an imprint for you called Silver Rings." So she published my first book, which is Staubs and Ditchwater. And that just got me started. So I worked with small publishers for my first 4 books. And then Llewellyn and Weiser took me on for 5 and 6. And then Llewellyn is the 7th one that's coming out in September, which is Small Magics, is also Llewellyn. And then I am writing now book number 8, which will also be published by Llewellyn next year, we hope, if it gets finished in time. And that's called Feral Church, Finding Goddess in the Wilderness. And that is a goddess theology book about, we have loved comfort for too long, and now we are in discomfort and uncomfort, and we don't have sometimes the protocols. We don't know how to deal with it when things go wrong and bad. And this is that kind of book. And that came to me when Carol Christ died. She was another huge influence on me spiritually. And she died a couple of years ago. And this project just fell in my lap. And I think it came directly from her. So all of that is true. I am in my copious spare time working on an Appalachian non-folklore book. And it's called The Ragged Wound, Healing the Soul of Appalachia. And I don't know that I will find a publisher for that, but it's important for me to do that, to talk about the value of this culture and the longevity of this culture and how we appear to the larger overculture and how we can fix that if we can. And I'm writing a musical adaptation thing of Midsummer Night's Dream. So lots of writing in between planting okra and onions.
That is a Shakespeare play that is near and dear to my heart. I want to ask you, I know many authors, and everybody is very excited to see their work on a bookshelf. But I think that in some ways, like when you're writing about spiritual practices or, the craft, I think that it must blow your mind a little bit to see you walk into a bookstore and you see your stuff on the shelf, or you go to a signing and people are having your book signed and they talk to you and they tell you about how you've impacted their lives. What has this been like for you personally?
Oh, it's been huge. It's been huge. I don't write to sell books. Please don't tell my publishers that.
Yeah, that's not good for them to hear.
I write hoping to sell books, I guess. Yeah, because I want the information out there. I only write things that I feel it's important to share. So when people contact me either through social media or they send me emails and they talk about, I read this particular book and it changed me, or I read this particular book and it gave me a sense of validation I'd never had before. So all of that, it makes me feel humble. It does. That the words that I jumble onto paper have some deep meaning for people. Yeah. So I love it. I love people to tell me, oh, this one section, I love that piece. I wrote a book called Embracing Willendorf, A Witch's Way of Loving Your Body to Health and Fitness, after I had a personal health crisis and I had to figure out what I was going to do. And I started listening to my body and giving my body what it needed and wanted. And I lost 100 pounds and, and I'm in probably better physical shape than I've been in my whole life. And that's the book. It doesn't sell the most, it has not sold the most copies. It is not a bestseller by any stretch of the imagination, but that is the book that people come back to me time and time again and say, I read your book, Embracing Willendorf, and it changed my life. And how powerful is that to hear? And it's often just one or two sentences in the whole of a book, in 60,000 words. It's 150 words right in the middle that hit somebody like an arrow through the heart, and they understand. We just don't know which 150 words it's going to be, or I just do a meme instead of writing a whole book.
You have a book in September that's going to be coming out, Small Magics, Practical Secrets from an Appalachian Village Witch. Can you talk to us about this book and what inspired you to write it?
Yes. I teach a class. Let me give you more backstory. It's like layers of backstory. So, as I said before, these practices are experiential. You can read all the books in the world and never be able to practice magic if you don't practice magic. So I started teaching teaching a class because I realized that I kept encountering people who just kept reading books and mouthing spells, and they didn't understand what I had learned years and years ago about harvesting energy and utilizing that energy through your intention to make magic. The basic principles of magic, they didn't know. They were still reading a rhymed couplet that someone wrote in a beautiful book and hoping that that would change their world. So I started teaching a class 5 or 6 years ago, called Simple Practical Magic. And the class is about grounding. It's about harvesting energy. It's about shielding. It's about sending energy through your body, wrapped in all that juicy intention, sending it out, and then monitoring the work you do to see if it was successful. And it was eye-opening for so many people who were like, oh, so there are like steps you can do. And I was like, yes, there are steps. So there was an argument in social media. Imagine that. Can you imagine it, Dean?
Wow, I didn't know that happened.
Arguing about something?
I know, surprising.
And I came into the conversation. It was probably on my page, actually. I came into the conversation and I said, oh my God, do I have to write a book based on simple practical magic? And enough people responded with yes, 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 that my editor at Llewellyn, Heather Green, sent me a private message, and she said, so send me a few words about this book so we can go ahead and get the contract written. And it was as simple as that. So I sent them a brief proposal and told them when I thought I could have the book ready, and started writing. So they titled it Small Magics, which I don't love the title, but that's their choice, because of this, as far as I'm concerned, are the foundations of magical practice. And if you don't learn these steps, these basic steps, I cannot tell you how many people say to me, oh, but I just can't ground. I just don't know how to do it. I mean, I try, but you don't understand. I'm an air sign. I'm a water sign. I'm a meh, meh, meh. And it is just technique and protocol. That's all it is. It's a technique, and you have to keep practicing it till you find a technique that works for you, because it's one of the most important, profoundly important things in all of magical practice, that you be able to ground yourself. And harvesting energy is the thing that comes right after. So that's what the book is about. And because I've had so many people say, but you don't understand, I don't know how to ground myself, that I've given them so many ways to ground. But the book encourages people over and over again, try what I did. If it doesn't work for you, make your own thing. Because it's all experiential. What works for me may not work for you. But if you and I talk about what it is we do and compare notes, rather than me just saying, no, that's not the way you do it, then we both have a greater chance of being not only good at those practices, but adept at those practices. And that's important to me, that people who claim to be magic workers actually work magic.
I want to ask you if we can expand a little bit on what Appalachian magic is and what differentiates it.
Well, first I'm going to tell you that most of the people in this part of Appalachia refer to it as Appalachian, but there are people in the northern part of the region who say Appalachian. So I want to get that out right up front, because my folks that are watching this are going, I can't believe you didn't correct him when he said Appalachian. But Appalachia is a really long, big region. And in the people in Pennsylvania who say Appalachian are as much Appalachian as we are. I come from the Southern Highlands, which is not coal country. It was timber country. So these forests I live in have been clear cut twice. It is jewel country. I like to think that the mountains here are so old and so heavy that they've compressed that coal into jewels. So you can go gem mining here, some extraordinary ruby, amethyst, emerald come out of these mountains. These mountains were settled. Initially, they were not settled, of course. They were during the woodland era, there were migratory folks who came through here and left potsherds and arrow points and moved on. And then there were many, many tribes here. But then the Cherokee came in, and I refer to them at the time as a settled empire. And they took over many of the tribes that were here before they were. And they have a profound effect on the folk magic here. But many of the people who practice in this region are what are referred to as Scots-Irish, Scotch-Irish, or Ulster Scots. And those are the people who were lowland border Scots who were removed into Northern Ireland, which was, of course, then Ulster. And then from there, they came to the so-called New World. And there they encountered the Dutch people, the Pennsylvania Dutch, who brought a lot into our folk magic. We compared notes, as I always encourage people to do. But I like to think that my people, and I am in fact Scots-Irish, made a hard left turn somewhere in Pennsylvania, and they came down the valley of the Shenandoah. And there they just peeled off until my people got down to here, to the Southern Highlands. And then that's where they met the Cherokee. So the folk magic has a lot of different influences. And I want to be very clear when I'm teaching about this. I am not saying that there were not enslaved African peoples in this area, because there were. But here in the mountains, there was not, we don't have big plantations. A little farther up in the region, there were people, enslaved Africans, who came in and then worked the mines. But here there were not so many, and they had a wonderful influence on our culture, but not there wasn't critical mass enough to have a profound influence on much of the folk magic, though there is some influence. So the big influence are the Scots-Irish coming in, the Dutch, German, and Cherokee. And the hallmarks are working with existing materials. Of all of it, as I said before, is filtered through Protestant Christianity. So much of it has to do with being a vessel for the work of the divine. And it is marked with a sense of humility, that this is not the work that you do of your own volition, but that you are merely a channel for the work of the divine. And classically, people referred to as the Holy Spirit coming in, or the Lord working through me, that sort of thing. I had a great aunt, my grandmother's sister, who could remove warts. And you would go to her with a wart, and she would put her thumb on it, apparently, and massage it. And the whole time she would be saying, now, I don't know why people come to me for this, because I don't have any real power over this. I don't have any real authority, but how are you? How's your mom? How's the new baby? She'd have that whole conversation, but she knew when the work was done, when her work was done, she'd remove her hand, and then she'd say, well, it was beautiful seeing you today. Give your mama a hug and a kiss for me, whatever. And then 3 days later, apparently the wart would fall off. And what we don't know is, was there something in the oil of her skin that interfered with the virus that causes warts? I mean, it could have been something that simple, that it wasn't necessarily the divine moving through her, but that she had some chemical extract in her skin. And I'm sure we could study that with the people who do that work now, and see if that's the truth. So in addition to the folkloric pieces that come from living with the land, there are also the pieces that, at least in the Scots-Irish part of my family, that come into you. In my family, it was when the girl became a woman, when she had her first menses, that she would receive gifts. And some of those are things like prophetic dreaming, which we now call precognitive dreaming, the ability to lay on hands and heal, the removal of warts, the taking the burn, taking the heat out of a burn, a number of folkloric practices that just seem to come to certain people. I had a young woman, I read tarot at a local metaphysical shop, Raven and Crone. This young girl came in to see me, and I asked, as I often do, so what are you looking for today? And she said, I'm looking to find out whether or not I'm crazy. And I said, that's way above my pay grade. I can't tell you that. But why don't you tell me what's going on, and we'll see what we can figure out. And she went through the whole litany of all of those, what I think of as Scots-Irish abilities. She saw dead people. She could communicate with dead people. She had dreams that came true. She could lay her hands on you and heal you. Done, one after the other. And I just smiled at her and I said, where are your people from? And she said, they're from McDowell County. And I said, before McDowell County, where are they from? And her shoulders came back and her chin went up, and she said, we're Scotch-Irish. And I said, okay, I can't really tell you whether or not you're crazy, but I can tell you that the Scots-Irish people, of which I am one, have a set of abilities just as you described. So that, I don't know that that's particularly a hallmark, but it certainly is part of what it is we do in the Southern Highlands. But these folk magics come down through families. So where I grew up, the cove where I grew up, I had cousins on the cove to the left and also the cove to the right. So there's a similarity there, but you go 3 miles away, and it's maybe a whole different family that has a whole different set of things that they do. So it's very individual, which again it's wonderful to compare notes about what it is people do and learn the other tricks and techniques.
Now, you also have a podcast of your own called the Wyrd Mountain Gals. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. And y'all can find us anywhere that podcasts are available. It's Wyrd, Wyrd, Mountain Gals. And it's a play on words of all of those bluegrass groups that are like the Foggy Mountain Boys and the Jiminy Creek Four Quartet or whatever. So we're the Wyrd Mountain Gals. We started this about 3 years ago. It got us through much of the pandemic. And we just talk about what it's like to be in Appalachia today. And you will hear my native accent, which I'm working on reclaiming slowly but surely. And we talk about some witchy things and pagan things, but mostly we just talk about life in Appalachia and what that's like and how that can be and how that should be.
Byron, I want to ask you, what's next for you? We talked about some of your books, but do you have any events or anything coming up this year where our listeners can see you?
Yeah, I've got a bunch of festivals coming up. I'm going to do Rites of Spring at the end of the month, and then go to Pagan Unity Fest. I'll be at Appalachian Summer Solstice, which is in Southern Ohio at Wisteria. And then I'll be up for Starwood, also at Wisteria. So I'm doing a lot of that. I will finish up the book that I'm writing now, and that will go in, we hope, 1st of September. And then I think the thing that I'm excited about right now, which is going to sound, no, it's not going to sound like anything, it's going to sound great, is that I'm working with Wren Adventures, and that's Wren as in Renaissance, Wren Adventures, to lead a tour next year to Cornwall.
Oh,
Cornwall
wow.
is Cornwall is one of the Celtic lands that doesn't get as much attention, I think, as it should. And it's full of ancient monuments. They're wonderful people. The food is good. And I know several people there who are willing to take on some of the teaching. And we'll be for many nights in a hotel near Tintagel. So we'll talk about the Arthur stuff. And I will talk way more about Morgan Le Fay than anybody wants to hear, because I love that whole Arthurian thing. And then we're going to go down deeper into Cornwall to St. Michael's Mount and Land's End. And we're going to meet a couple of village witches who are going to talk about the work that they do. So that is all in process. And of course, it won't happen if people don't sign up for it. But that information should be out in the next few weeks, I think, so that people can choose whether or not they would like to go to Cornwall with me.
I don't know. I can't imagine why they wouldn't. That sounds wonderful.
Oh, it's going to be great fun. I can hardly wait. And also with Wren Adventures, we're looking at a possible tour of Sicily in 2 years. So not next year, but the year after. So that'll be fun. I've been learning Italian so that I can at least have some idea of what's going on.
That sounds great. Byron, I've really enjoyed getting a chance to talk to you. I hope we get to talk again. This has been so
just
fun.
Let me know when. This is delightful.
That was my conversation with writer, folklorist Byron Ballard. We have links in the bio so you can look at her books and maybe purchase them online through one of the distributors listed. We also have a link to her website on the bio. Please tune in to the Calling the Quarters podcast next week, where I'll be talking with writer, singer, activist Thorn Coyle. Until then, have a blessed week.